The rest of the story. Never before in American history has there been such a presidential election. Oh, I know the historians regularly re-examine the machinations and ramifications of the Lincoln elections and the inglorious quest for the White House by Hayes and Tilden in 1876, after which interminable speeches and debates at last favored the former by a congressional vote. But what about this presidential election of 2000? For weeks, it was too close to call? Or was it? Nope. Somebodies did call it Bush, and confidently, and many days before the actual vote. In fact, many weeks before Florida certified and Gore retreated to impossible dreaming in the courts. Who knew in advance? Well, who ought to have known? The election night analysts ought to have known. Locked up in their rooms full of computers with exit polling data streaming in, those experts should have called the big race cold. Problem was, they should not have called it at all. And the trouble started, as the nation would eventually painfully become aware, in our own far southeast, handing Florida to Gore early in the evening. I mean, the professional prognosticators misinformed the networks accordingly, and the latter, eager to best one another in reporting results, perhaps even eager to paint more blue on the map, announced that the Sunshine State had gone Democrat, announced that even before the polls had closed. Republicans subsequently and justifiably howled that Bush voters in the Panhandle may have been influenced, may have stayed home in despair, and what of states westward, where the polls would be open for hours more? Might undecideds there not hop atop the apparent Gore bandwagon? Of course, by dawn's early light, after Florida results had toggled back and forth through the night, there was much name-calling and blame-assigning. Some networks charged the analysts with jumping the gun. Some analysts reversed the charges, citing that television coverage, which they admitted that they had observed as they prepared their projections, subtly, insidiously influenced their closest calls. But one group had predicted accurately, absolutely. One group had pooled their intellectual resources and 2-to-1 predicted Bush. And that same group has been predicting elections since 1956. That's almost half 100 years. Since 1956, it has accurately projected the winner of each and every United States presidential election, including the super-close Kennedy victory of 1960. Pundits noisily come and often quietly go, but one particular pre-election poll has called it right 12 straight, demonstrating of those being polled a wisdom, how should we say this, a wisdom beyond their years. For the voters in that perennially precise pre-election election, in all of the United States and the District of Columbia, they voted 2-to-1 for George W. Bush, reliably reflecting the final outcome of the confounding election. These were all pre-voting age school children, grades 4 and up, participants in our nation's oldest kids poll, which is held every 4 years. The voters are the readers of the publication Weekly Reader. And now you know the rest of the story.
And now for the rest of the story. In Mr. Harvey's broadcast, he mentioned that the Weekly Reader presidential election poll began in 1956. According to Scholastic, the parent company for Weekly Reader, the poll actually began in 1940. Even Wikipedia claims that the poll began in 1956. From 1940 to 1956, the students chose the wrong candidate only twice. In 1948, the students chose New York Governor Thomas Dewey over Harry Truman. Dewey was overwhelmingly the early favorite. On November 3rd, 1948, the Chicago Daily Tribune jumped the gun and published a front-page article entitled "Dewey Defeats Truman." By the time the results were finalized, the newspapers had already gone out to the public. This caused a black spot in the reputation of the newspaper because, as we know, Truman, not Dewey, Truman won the election. To add insult to injury, at a train stop at St. Louis Union Station following the election, Truman held up the newspaper for all to see, and all did see. The photograph of Truman holding up the newspaper has become famous. The two major candidates for the 1960 presidential election were incumbent Vice President Richard Nixon and Senator John F. Kennedy. In August 1960, most polls gave Nixon a slim lead over Kennedy. In that same month, President Eisenhower held a televised press conference. Remember that Nixon was vice president under Eisenhower. Reporter Charles Moore of Time asked President Eisenhower if he could give an example of a major idea of Nixon's that he had heeded. Eisenhower quipped, "If you give me a week, I might think of one." That single remark led the public to believe that Nixon was not as capable as Kennedy at decision-making. The Kennedys saw this as an opportunity and used Eisenhower's statement in television commercials.
Every Republican politician wants you to believe that Richard Nixon is, quote, experienced. They even want you to believe that he has actually been making decisions in the White House. But listen to the man who should know best, the President of the United States. A reporter recently asked President Eisenhower this question about Mr. Nixon's experience.
I just wondered if you could give us an example of a major idea of his that you had adopted in that role as the decider and final.
If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember.
Because
At the same press conference, President Eisenhower said,
no one can make a decision except me.
and as for any major ideas from Mr. Nixon,
If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember.
President Eisenhower could not remember, but the voters will remember. For real leadership in the 60s, help elect Senator John F. Kennedy president.
Then came the Kennedy-Nixon debates, the first presidential debates ever held on television. Kennedy took a break from campaigning before the debates and appeared calm, cool, and confident. He even had a tan. He'd prepared extensively for the debate. Nixon, on the other hand, campaigned until just a few hours before the televised debates began. He refused to wear makeup for the first debate and had not shaved. He looked pale, underweight, tired, and his stubble was visible to the audience. Nixon was visibly sweating during the debate as well. His appearance on the debate was so shocking that Nixon's own mother called immediately following the broadcast to ask if he was sick. Also, Kennedy's black suit stood out against the gray background while Nixon's suit blended almost perfectly with the background. An estimated 70 million viewers watched this televised debate. The Weekly Reader voters must have been bed during the debate. Mr. Harvey said in his broadcast that the Weekly Reader voters had elected Kennedy in the super close election of 1960, but once again, according to Scholastic, the children elected Nixon. Since Mr. Harvey's broadcast, we've had 5 more elections. How did the students do in these Weekly Reader polls? Let's find out. In 2004, George W. Bush sought re-election and ran against Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts. More than 500,000 children from grades 1 through 8 cast their votes. When the final results were announced, Bush won the re-election with 52% of the vote. The Weekly Readers were right. Bush was re-elected. In 2008, Senators John McCain and Barack Obama ran for president. This time, the school children elected Obama by 57% of the vote. Obama was elected president. In 2012, incumbent President Barack Obama ran against Republican candidate Mitt Romney. Nearly 250,000 students cast their ballots. Obama received 51% of the vote and Mitt Romney received 45% of the vote. And as we know, Obama was re-elected. In 2016, about 153,000 students cast their ballots in the race between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton received 52% of the student vote and Donald Trump received just 35%. But when the results came in the real election, Trump had won. Following the official announcement that Trump would be the next president, large protests broke out across the country, some of which lasted several days. Some protesters held up signs which said, "Not my president," and "We don't accept President-elect." Most election forecasters predicted that Hillary Clinton would win and were in shock that their foolproof systems had failed. Mainstream media said the election was an upset and described the outcome as shocking. In 2020, the last time the Weekly Reader took a poll, incumbent President Donald Trump ran against former Vice President Joe Biden. More than 168,000 students voted and selected Joe Biden as the winner at 61% of the vote against Trump's 39%. As we know, Joe Biden became president. Since 1940, the children who voted in the Weekly Reader presidential polls were only wrong 3 times. That's not a bad average. Remember to join my channel to get access to perks and bonus materials. I'll leave a link to join in the description below. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching, and as Paul Harvey would say, good day.